Where's the control? We have this one. Yeah. Thank you very much. My name is Chris Sherington. I'm the Head of Environmental Policy and Economics at Eunomia Research and Consulting. And I'm going to be talking today about the work we've been doing over the past 8 months, exploring how a deposit return system would work in the Czech Republic, and to understand in some detail the costs and the associated impacts. Thank you. So just a little bit about Eunomia, briefly. We're a UK headquartered environmental consultancy, and we cover, in terms of topics, all aspects relating to the circular economy. So waste prevention, waste management. We have teams of people who work on detailed collection modelling for municipalities, so really getting into the nuts and bolts of the type of the vehicles, the containers, real detail about how you do that for different materials, all the way to working on policy design at the national and European level. And we've been working, I just realised we're missing, actually, we have an Athens, it's not up to date, we have an Athens office. We've been doing a lot of work in Southeast Europe recently. We now have an Athens office, which I'll get in trouble if I didn't mention this newly opened office in Southeast Europe. But we're an independent consultancy. So we're not, many environmental consultancies are not targeting any particular names, but they work as part of larger engineering consultancies. We're totally independent. We have no technology that we seek to give preference to. So we work independently. And we've been working on deposits for about 10 years now. The first time we looked at deposits was for the Irish government. We're conducting a waste review for all of waste management in Ireland, and the minister was particularly keen on deposits because he knew about the litter reduction potential. So we looked into them, and we spent quite a bit of time in the intervening years exploring the ways in which these systems work, and they're often very different. There's no standard DRS. There's some that work really well, and they share some common design features, and there's others that work less well. So we've been looking at a range of systems. So in North America, we have some of the most long-standing systems, some in place since the 1970s, and they're particularly interesting, sometimes for the wrong reasons, because in the US, some of the ways in which they've been designed, sort of lock-in decay, these things ossify because the operators aren't allowed to change things. So it's a really good example of what not to do. We've also done studies, so that's reviewing existing schemes. We've also looked at modelling potential schemes and drawing on best practice from around the world, much of which is in Europe, Northern Europe in particular. So in terms of our role here, we were asked by Insieme Mattoni to draw on global best practice to design a DRS for the Czech Republic. And once we've designed the scheme, to understand the costs and the impacts relating to the system costs and the revenues, how to get its funding, what does it have to pay out, looking at the impacts on stakeholders and the wider environmental benefits. Now, we heard earlier on about the life cycle assessment. We've used that information and we've applied it within the framework of cost-benefit analysis, so trying to put a monetary value on some of the environmental benefits. So what is a DRS? So this is a photo of a colleague of mine in a country, the UK, where we don't have a DRS, and we do have a problem with littering. But first and foremost, a DRS, it is a form of extended producer responsibility. Now, in some forums you will hear people talk about EPR or DRS. Now, this is a false distinction, so just look out for that if you see it. What people are talking about there is the current EPR system, the current PRO, the Producer Responsibility Organisation, operating a green dot style approach. So that is what they're talking about, and yes, that is a form of EPR, but deposits is a form of EPR, and it's in many ways it's a really pure form of EPR. The deposit incentivises high levels of return for recycling, but also to reduce litter. So this is not paying people to recycle. It's actually more powerful than that. It is incentivizing people to get their money back. So you're not paying people, they've already paid you, they've paid the deposit, And we know from prospect theory that loss aversion, people will go out, they'll work harder to avoid a loss than to seek a gain. So getting your money back is a really powerful influence. So the key aims: to increase recycling, to get very high rates, and to reduce litter. And on both these counts, deposits work. So this is this interesting graph that we put together quite recently. I've been talking to someone in the UK about we have a discussion about a deposit return scheme there, and his view was, well, we're doing pretty well. We think we might be around sort of 70% recycling. Why bring about all this change to get to 90%? So I showed him this graph, which I'd done a few weeks earlier. So what this shows is the cumulative effect of high recycling rates, the importance here of getting high recycling rates. So if you start with, let's say, call it enough PET for 1,000 bottles. If you have a 90% recycling rate, the first round of recycling, you get 900 bottles worth back, then 810, and so on. If you have only a 10% recycling rate, from the initial material from 1,000, you get 100 back, then 10, then 1. So it's a little bit like compound interest. You get the effect really builds. So what we're looking at here is the number of subsequent bottles that can be made afterwards. If you're at 70%, you're here. At 90%, you're here. So actually, it's not. The benefit doesn't drop off. It increases. As you get to those higher rates, you're displacing more and more virgin material. So it is really important to get the high rates of high quality capture. I think this is something that, it's a new diagram that's put out there, and so far it's been, I think it's quite a useful way of explaining a very important point about the high rates. Now, in terms of litter, we have looked at the evidence. There's not much evidence from Europe about the litter reduction effect of deposits. And in many ways, that's quite surprising. But actually, in the places where it's been put in, it's been just let's get some really good high return rates, and yes, we'll reduce littering. But in the States, in the 70s and early 80s, one of the motivating factors was to tackle litter. So they did look at this, not in a huge amount of detail, but the available evidence suggests that you get about a 90%, maybe 95% reduction in littering of deposit-bearing containers. And that's really important, not just because we want less litter, and because we know about the negative effects litter has on people, and on wildlife, and actually on the way it makes people feel about their local environment, but from a financial perspective as well. It already costs municipalities quite a lot to pick up litter. And as Clarissa mentioned earlier, under the Single-Use Plastics Directive, for PET bottles, there will be financial responsibility for the litter cleanup of those PET bottles under Article 8. So it's expensive to pick up litter. If you think about, Buoy and Slap, the ocean cleanup is my sort of extreme example of this. If you wanted to get good quality feedstock, get a boat. The last thing you do is get a boat and go out into the ocean to get it. It's to a smaller extent, litter collection is difficult because it's spread around everywhere. So this is a cost that producers will face under the Single-Use Plastics Directive. So what we do know, that the Commission hasn't determined the methodology that will be used to say, well, what portion of overall litter costs should be covered and which are attributable to PET bottles. But it's probably going to be a large number. And what we can say is under DRS, that number will be 1/10 or less of what it would otherwise have been. So how does it work? I think people are pretty familiar with the flow. We have the flow of material from the producer, places the beverage container with the retailer to the consumer. They bring it back to the retailer, goes within the system, then for reprocessing and back into new material again. The deposit flows in a different direction. So the system operator is paid by the producer when they put it on the market. The retailer pays the producer when they take delivery of the product. The consumer pays the retailer, they get it back. So there's a flow in both directions there. And it's not a new idea. This is something that's been around in many different places. And as Clarissa mentioned, in the last 6 months, we've seen a real ramp up in activity on this. And a large part of the reason is because the Commission's Single-Use Plastic Directive, I'm sure, and many people seeing the way things are going with that. So we need to update this slide as well, because obviously Australia is getting to be the first continent where it is entirely covered. So, design. We are looking at a system which is a centralized system, one single operator with oversight of everything. This is really important from the data perspective. The return options are return to the retailer, and they either go compacted in a reverse vending machine straight to the reprocessor, or collected via a smaller retailer, bagged up, go into a counting centre and back. It'll be producer-owned, a not-for-profit system, so the task of the operator will be to achieve the targets, which we suggest is a 90% return rate target at least cost, and they'll be able to flex aspects of the system design to get that. So we are looking at, we've been asked to look at two scenarios, one which is PET only, one which is PET and metal. So we're not looking at glass, we're not looking at wine, we're not looking at milk, we're not looking at Tetra Pak for the time being. This is the scope of what we're asked to do, and it's important that you have supporting instruments. When you define the scope of what's in, like that, you have to make sure there's adequate supporting instruments to ensure a level playing field. So we're suggesting there could be something like a Norwegian beverage container tax to ensure everything is fair on that basis. Yeah, okay. So the deposit level, there's a number of different ways of incentivizing high return rates, and the deposit level is one of them, and we reckon that 3 Czech crown should be an appropriate level. This is in line with others elsewhere, and on a PPP adjusted basis, this is about where it should be for that. So 1 deposit for all container sizes. On the return infrastructure, we recommend return to retail because of the greater convenience for consumers. Alternatives are redemption centres where people have to drive separately to take them, so it's not with a retailer. Retailers, importantly, will get handling fees to compensate for the space taken up, for the purchase of an RVM, if necessary. They won't be required to purchase an RVM. This will be up to them. But you have to make the calculation of, based on the handling fee you get, what the payback is going to be and how worthwhile it is for the individual retailer. So we've modelled higher fees for those using compacting RVMs, because that then reduces the potential for fraud, because the containers are compacted, and through increasing the bulk density, reduces the onward logistics costs. So again, this is one of the tools that the operator has to flex these tools to get overall efficiency savings. In terms of fraud prevention, we're not suggesting an expensive German ink type approach. So in terms of the mass flows, the baseline situation is one you'd be familiar with from the presentation this morning. We use the Ecocom figures of the amount placed on the market and returned. We modelled the 90% return rate under a DRS for PET, and then we have the metal as well. In terms of the cost to the system, for PET only and for PET with metal, the bulk of the costs are the handling fees. It's about 3/4 of the overall cost of the system are the payments to the retailers to compensate them for the time and the space and the cost there. We have transport, and then we have the administrative costs for the central system, the counting centre costs as well, and we look at fraud losses as well, so we do cover some of those. So, but the way to work this back is ultimately the costs come down to the producer fee. So what is the cost for the producer for every beverage container placed on the market? For PET only, it's about 1 euro cent per container, and we did the same thing for PET and metal. And the cost for PET comes down because you've got more material, more containers going through the system. You get economies of scale, and the producer fee for aluminium, for the metal, is actually negative because of the high material value. So, and that's not inconsistent with what we've seen elsewhere. You have a negative fee, or perhaps a zero fee, or perhaps a negative fee as well. So the handling fees, we modelled these. Ultimately, handling fees, they tend to be a negotiated approach. So there'll be modelling to undertake analysis of what they should be, but then it does ultimately come down to negotiation. And we can see when we can compare the system revenues, where you have metal included, the material income is that much greater. I don't know why that's done that. But Yeah, so the three sources of income are the material revenues, the unredeemed deposits, and then the producer fee makes up the balance to ensure that the system operates at no profit. So if material values are high, the producer fee will be lower, but then that's entirely consistent with the producer having to buy virgin material anyway. So in terms of managing the costs, they're best placed to do that. So in terms of the impacts, Ecocom will lose about 10 million euros in fees under the situation where it's PET only, and 11 when it's PET and metal. But obviously the scope of the whole existing scheme for EPR will be changing dramatically in terms of the cost coverage and the wider expectations. So there's a shifting landscape there. There'll be some collection cost savings. We've modelled this due to reduced frequency of collections from the containers, which we share with the municipalities. And there'll be savings in terms of sorting, bulking, and hauling costs as well. Municipalities, one of the important features of a DRS is it draws material out of the residual stream. So one of the key savings is the saving in landfill costs. So we've modelled this based on current costs. We've also done a sensitivity looking at if the cost of landfill increases to 80 euros per tonne, what would it look like then? And again, the municipalities would share some of the collection cost savings with Ecocom. Separation facilities, they would save some costs, they would lose some material revenues. We reckon overall this will be the loss, but obviously you've got a changing landscape in terms of other materials that they can take in. And an environmental impact, we looked at the impacts from the LCA. We put a monetary value on those, like the air quality damage costs, which are amenable to valuation. We also looked at terrestrial litter, and basing this on willingness to pay for a cleaner environment, what people have said they'd be happy to pay for their council tax fees or municipality fees. And there's actually a very conservative figure. So this is stripping out any marine litter considerations. This is just neighbourhood litter, and it's just for that remains in the environment once the flow of litter that gets dropped and picked up has been removed. So actually this is quite a conservative figure on that. In conclusion, a DRS is not designed to solve all the waste challenges. It's not intended to tackle everything. But for beverage containers, it is a cost-effective solution. We have the 0.78 euro cent fee for PET alone. As part of a joint system, it's either no fee or negative fee for aluminium. And the producer costs are lower in average than the current PRO fees if metal is included in the system. We'll achieve a 90% plus recycling rate and a 90% plus reduction in litter. You get a really high quality supply of material for recycled content, and it's at no cost to taxpayers. So again, to summarise, we have the system, the costs on the left side for PET only and PET and metal, and the revenues which match those, so it's a not-for-profit system overall. And here are some of the changes in the sort of financial situations for the different stakeholders. And by far the largest positive impact is on the environmental benefits side. Thank you very much.